live from the internet. It's ZNLive. That's right. We're very excited today. We have a very special guest, Karmen Špiljak, who's actually worked with ZN in a past life. She's also got extensive experience. She's been living in different parts of the world, from Brussels to Brazil to Belgrade. And she was at the European Parliament in ZN, working with WWF, all in communication and digital communication. And she has now become an author, a published author of several novels, including a thriller crime novel, which is her latest one called No Such Thing as Goodbye. So we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling and living in all these different places. So Karmen, you just came back from Brazil to Belgrade. So how has the change been? How has it been to go from one place to the other? Something you've already done before, obviously, but how has the adaptation been for you to Belgrade?
Yeah, so I did move many times, mostly within Europe before. This was the first time when I had a long move, and I have to say I'm still adjusting to European speed of life. Everything seems to happen much faster here, but it's also very nice to be in an environment that is somehow familiar and known, and I can gorge on all the foods and drinks that I've been missing for years in Brazil. But yeah, it's sort of bittersweet. I love my time in the tropics. I think I'll also love my time here. It's mostly going to be difficult for winters because, as you know, Brazil is a hot country and I am totally not prepared. I was wearing jackets with 20 degrees, so I have no idea what I'm going to wear with real winter here.
Excellent. Yeah, and we've been traveling more and more at ZN because we have this remote network now, so people work from many different places. I'm actually going to head back to India in October so that I can also protect myself from the winter and come back later on. But you've been an experienced communicator, and when you were with us, you were doing a lot of strategy and writing and storytelling. And I think every communicator at some level has a kind of book inside them that they'd love to read, to write, but they don't. So how did you make the step between being, writing for other people to say, you know what, I want to do my own writing? When did that start? What triggered the change?
Yeah, it's I think a question probably many people are asking, people who want to write. So I wrote actually since very early age. I wrote for myself. I didn't consider this to be a career because it was not presented as career when I was learning about writers. I mean, these were mostly people I couldn't relate to because they were, almost exclusively men who were drinking themselves to death, dying in poverty. I mean, it was not really presented as a career choice. So for me, it was always something I did on the side. So I wrote, but I didn't take time specifically for writing. When I was inspired, when I had idea, I would write. And then actually during my time at ZN, I think Helen at the time gave me a book, One Thing, and the summary of the book was pretty much what is your one thing that you want to focus on. And I realized that is writing. So I started purposefully a lot of time before I went to work. To write every morning. I would take a half an hour, and I would write, and I would do it consistently every day. And basically that's the only thing I did that was different. I took time. I still write every day or most of the days. I do take holidays occasionally, but that's really the only thing, because the more you write, the more you get used to it, the easier it becomes, and the more organically stories develop. Also, of course, you become better at it. So that's sort of say the only advice. It's not very profound, but it does work.
And I think coming back to the question of communication, because I think that in our field everything is about telling stories. So how much did you bring your storytelling experience from communication into your writing, and how different do you feel this is? In business communication, people talk a lot about how we all need to become storytellers. Do you think that's true? And did you kind of build the same skills from your communication into your actual books?
I think it probably went both ways. I suppose part of why I loved working in communication is because I love storytelling, and this is a way of storytelling. I think I only became more aware of different tools when I worked in communication, so different storytelling tools. I definitely think people are wired for stories. So if you say tell something as a story, it's going to be much more appealing because people will be able to connect with it, rather than if it's like a bunch of facts basically presented or a paper. Because I mean, we don't relate to facts in the same way we relate to stories, and stories can touch us on an emotional level. And I think this is basically what people are looking for, some kind of a connection. And I do think with stories, this is very easy. So I mean, people read for different reasons, either to be entertained or just to lose themselves, to forget that they're reading. And I think when you bring these skills into communications, you can really achieve a lot if you basically manage to touch what is the heart of the story or what the story is about. Because I think often things can get lost or muddled, and then in the end we don't really know what we want to say. But if we apply these storytelling skills, I think it's very easy. I'm not sure if everybody should be a storyteller, but I think if you use some of these skills, you can basically improve your communication skills, as well as like just basically everyday skills.
Yeah, and in terms of what you bring to those stories, how much of your personal experience do you bring into those stories? We were just talking before we went live about your connection to Brussels. So you're talking about a spy story. So are you bringing in your life and your experiences into the story? And are you gonna bring in Brussels?
Yeah, I mean, I do, of course, always take some stuff from my day-to-day life. It's not the stuff people would assume. So it's not the exciting stuff that is in the story, but it's usually some mundane thing that I notice. And then I ask myself a question: what if something would happen? And then this is how the story starts. And with Brussels, I always basically wanted to write a spy story because I thought it's like a bit. I found it a bit more for me a bit more feasible story to write than some kind of murder mystery, because I was like only beginning to write crime. And Brussels is known as the city of spies, and I always found that intriguing when I worked there, because there are so many organizations and you meet so many people. In the end, you don't know who is who. So basically, I just started from that, but nothing really happened until I got an idea for the character. This character arrived, and then only then basically the story, so to say, was born, and I could write it down. And for me, writing about places I visited or places I miss is a way to revisit these places. So I definitely am looking forward, like book 2, the one I'm writing now, the spy thriller series, is happening in Brussels, and I am already planning of all the places that the heroine, the protagonist, is going to visit and things to do. So yeah, definitely taking mundane bits of my life, but not anything, so to say, of substance, because this I prefer to keep for myself.
Yeah, and I think that there's some really interesting places in Brussels where a lot of things could happen. Because you could easily be sitting and there's a minister or prime minister or some very important discussion in a restaurant, which with no security and no particular things. I think it's quite an interesting thing for potential drama to happen. We have Daniel from Valencia saying, "Hi, long time no see, Carmen," and Justin, who said diplomacy and espionage go hand in hand like a perfect marriage. Very, very good point. Now, in terms of the way people have to bring, for communicators, what would you say, what would be your advice to people so that they improve the way they tell stories? Because, as we were discussing, it is a skill that communicators look for. What do you think, what would be your advice to communicators in terms of making that storytelling better?
I mean, it's going to be, again, not very profound, but I mean, it's something that works for me. One is trial and error, basically. Take the same story, start telling it. Either you tell it like face to face to people and just watch their reaction. See at what, I mean, it's very easy to see when people's attention drops, when they, perk up and they want to know more. Or if you give it to somebody to write, to give you feedback, to read, to give a feedback, then just ask them and basically retell the same story. Let it rest for a while, rewrite it, re-edit until it's better. Usually less is more. You will see some parts that are important for you as a writer to get into the story you can cut out later because they're not so important for the reader. And like basically analyze. I think the thing I like to do a lot when I read and I get like my hands on a book that I cannot put down, or there's something I'm listening on a podcast and I just cannot, like I put everything aside. I cannot like pause even to take a short break because it's just so thrilling. Then I go back to it later and I wonder why. What was that really drove me to continue to listen? Was it like what kind of feelings did it evoke and so on? So I analyze a lot about things that work for me. I know this is not going to be the same for everybody, but if you know at least what works for you, then you know what kind of topics, themes you're interested in, and what kind of things inspire you, so you can then play with that. So a lot is actually on the, so to say, quiet and analytical side. So just analyze and then trial and error, and I think that's basically it.
Karmen, you said that when you were young, it was very hard for you to see yourself as a writer because there were no role models. What writers, I guess, female writers, do you see as examples for yourself now? And how can we change this perception, or has it already changed for girls these days?
I think it has changed a lot these days. Depends on the genre, of course. I mean, of course, Agatha Christie is the queen of crime. I mean, I love everything she's written in terms of story structure. She's really great. There are some modern crime writers that I like Sarah Hillary, Sarah Pinborough, and not all of them are called Sarah, but they are two of the ones that I like. And I think the trend has now switched to the point that in crime genre, for instance, men would use initials or female pseudonyms so that they would get more chance, because most readers are female. So I think it has improved a lot, and thanks also to basically the revolution that was called self-publishing, because this all of a sudden removed the middleman, and many people were able to share their stories with the world, and many writers came out basically who are now best-selling writers from this. I think what we can do, I mean, I'm not sure specifically for the writing, but I think it's always good if kids or young adults are encouraged to discover different things, and especially in the creative arena, which is not always considered to be very productive, so to say, that we put this productivity aside and we just let them play, because often a lot can come out of it. And often some people who have, I mean, many writers I meet studied law, especially many lawyers and other things, and they've at some point decided this is not giving them the fulfillment they want, and they basically looking for ways how to turn it into a full career, the writing, and they did. So I think it's always good to keep an open mind in a way and find this back door, for some little pleasure in your life, even if there are no role models, just to kind of let that pleasure grow. I think that's like allow that space.
Great. Let's go to some concrete recommendations. You already mentioned some authors named Sarah. So we have a nice jingle for that. Love it. Karmen, tell us, what should we read or listen to?
So I'll just go quickly through some podcasts that I love. Podcast Hidden Brain. It's a scientific podcast dissecting many issues from aspects of what it means to be human, make mistakes, and so on. And it's really insightful. Often I listen to it, I get ideas for stories. BBC Food Chain is one of my favorite podcasts. It just covers food from sustainability, restaurants, growing, everything that you can imagine. And I'm a massive foodie, so I would recommend anybody who likes food stuff to listen to that. Then Where Should We Begin by Esther Perel. I find it an incredible podcast where she always interviews two couples that basically share an issue with her, and then while they discuss, usually they discover that the issue they present is not the real issue. And I find it fascinating how basically a complete stranger in a half an hour, 1 hour discussion can, with her communication skills are amazing. Her listening, I think this is the key lesson for any communicator. She listens, of course, observes the body language, but she basically then can lead them to the real issue. And from there, once they have identified that, it's very easy to find different solutions or ways out. So I find this such a fascinating podcast. I would really recommend it to everybody. I don't know if we have time for more recommendations.
I think I have one podcast recommendation. Actually, I've gone back to the TED interview, which I listened to some time back. There's a new host who's replaced Chris Anderson, who's the TED curator, called Stephen Johnson. And there's a really nice transitional podcast where they talk about ideas and how the Enlightenment happened when we moved from drinking beer to coffee, and how new ideas can be transformed. It's a theme that I really like. And there's one on the brain, by the way, Karmen, you might like, with David Eagleman, who's basically an expert in how brain reshapes perception. So that's my podcast recommendation. What about you, Liara? What is your podcast recommendation?
I will get to that in 1 second. I first want to say that Esther Perel is indeed amazing, and also want to praise all the psychotherapists and psychoanalysts in this world. Both my parents are psychoanalysts. My father is 78 and still working, still has clients and helping a lot of people. And it's, of course, not in one session, but in a series of sessions that you're transforming their life. And that brings me to my recommendation of this week, which is also called Transformations, or the Latin word, and I'm not going to pronounce it in Latin. I'm going to try to pronounce it in English, which is just say it, Phil.
Metamorphosis.
Thank you, Phil. That's such a good pronunciation of that word. Written by Publius Ovidius Naso, or Ovid in English. And this is one of the most amazing poems, because it's a series of poems of all time. Of course, about transformation, about Pantare, how everything flows. Because it shows that if something terrible happens, like you're a god, Apollo, and you want to rape a girl, Daphne, and you just turn into a tree so that god cannot rape you. Or about Narcissus and Icarus and Pythagoras. And it's just an amazing story, a series of stories, 250 stories about transformation. It details the history of the world from its creation until the death of Julius Caesar. And if you haven't read it, there are hundreds of translations, so you can certainly find one or attempt it in its original Latin, which you should, because it's just brilliantly written. Its style is just magnificent, and of course, if you can read it in its original version, it's even better. In the 8th century, when it was written, or in the 9th century, it was even called the Bible for artists, and so many paintings have been created on the basis of this amazing book. I will say again, transformations, because I have a problem pronouncing that word for some reason. So it is also a book of hope, and that you can always transform yourself. So absolutely recommend this if you haven't read it already. Of course, it's very old, so you probably did already.
Karmen, I think you had a couple of book recommendations for us.
Yes. So I always have a lot of book recommendations. Stop me when I'm going overboard. But a book that I really liked, it's a book for young adults, actually. It's called The Apology Box of Naomi Alstead. And it's a beautiful story about a young girl making a terrible, devastating mistake that then she ends up paying for. But also this process of redemption brings her through a very, so to say, difficult but rewarding personal journey. I really found it very touching and very easy to relate to, even though the basically protagonist is like a teenager, so somebody I was a while ago. And if I can just sneak in another book which I like, is fiction book. Also, is called The Kiss Before Dying by author. I think he's a hugely underrated author, Ira Levin. Also author of Stepford Wives, and many Sliver and many other great books that have been made into movies. So A Kiss Before Dying is basically a crime story book. where I find it fascinating that he switches perspective. So you see you see the killer, or you see the killer's perspective. You know how he looks like, but I mean, until like I think more than half of the book, you still don't know who they are. I mean, it's so written, like I could not put that book down, and I want to reread it and reanalyze it. But it's really, really a thrilling read. Like if you're looking just something to lose yourself in it, then I'd recommend that.
Perfect. So I think those sounds like great recommendations. My recommendation is actually The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I think many people know. It's a kind of classic. I think it's a great also murder mystery. And you know, the interesting thing about a book is what you remember from the book might not be the plot itself, but the feeling and the context and the characters. And I think there, to me, is the conversations between the characters and the feeling and the kind of the way they captured kind of the teenage coming of age and you know, murdering people by mistake, let's say. Basically, I think it's and of course the way the whole story is revealed, I thought was connected very well with the audience. And of course, we're going to recommend all your books, and we're going to drop links to them below so that people can check them out. So we look forward to checking out No Such Thing as Goodbye, and of course, Add Signy to Taste and A Perfect Floor. So we'll have some links to all of those. So thank you very much for being with us. Have a fabulous weekend. Stay in touch, and hopefully when you next come to Brussels, or when we come to your part of the world, we can meet up for coffee, and have a fabulous weekend.
Yeah, thanks for inviting. Have a great weekend. Ciao.
Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.